Next up, Lindsay Ballant, an art director and designer with a passion for journalism, storytelling, global culture, and baseball. Based in Baltimore, Maryland, she is currently the art director of the Baffler, a publication you should definitely check out if you haven't. Previously, she's applied her love of shapes and colors to print magazine, the New York Times Magazine, Newsweek, and Foreign Policy. She occasionally writes and designs other things, loves her dog and boyfriend, and does not care for late capitalism and most condiments. Please welcome Lindsay Ballant.
Hi. Hi. I don't go anywhere without a script, so... Is this on? Oh, wait, it is on. Okay. There we go. Okay, hello everyone. I wanted to thank the fine folks at Dynamo for putting this conference on, and thanks to all the other speakers for all the inspiring work and inspiring ideas throughout the day. So as said, yes, I'm Lindsay. I'm a designer and art director who's worked mainly in editorial throughout my career. And as the bio says, I'm currently art director of the Baffler, which is a publication based out of New York. It's a quarterly publication. It was recently redesigned. This is some of the covers since I've been there. And let's see if this works. This is sort of a sample of what the inside of the Baffler looks like. It's a publication of political and critical criticism, that was started back in 1988. And if you look at the first few issues, I like to describe them as sort of a zine-like antidote to The New Yorker. And I'd say this is the first issue and the third issue. These are 5th, 7th, kind of the early 90s issues. And I'd say it still embodies that kind of anti-elite sentiment without being anti-intellectual. And they were publishing stories about terms like late capitalism and neoliberalism back in the 90s. And needless to say, there's been a sort of outpouring of interest, especially since last year, for good writing on that kind of subject. And they are by nature sort of contrarian, and that's probably why it's the best job I personally feel like I've ever had. And I fit in there so well, and I want to work there forever. But enough about the Baffler. I'm not really here today to talk about my work. I'm here to sort of elaborate on a point I made in previous talks in sort of various forms, and sort of take on my own cultural criticism, if you will, but specifically focused on our own industry and to spark progressive discourse as we were all promised today. And so I wanted to talk about the idea, or rather the divide I see between our lives as sort of designers and creatives and our sort of lifestyles as designers and creatives. And I'm sure everyone here can relate to this idea. In this age, every professional, but especially people who work within a visual medium, are encouraged, or rather required, to develop and cultivate a sort of personal brand, right? So what does a personal brand sort of mean for creatives? This is what Google image search says what a personal brand is. I really like the, the Venn diagram. I think that's probably what I think of when I think of personal brand. Also, here's, one of those word map association things. Anyway, so what does a personal brand mean for ourselves, right? Well, it means sort of a slick portfolio site using one of the most up-to-date templates. I know this campaign was based in 2013, but it's still kind of relevant. It's a carefully curated Facebook and/or Twitter feed that's the right ratio of self-promotion, links to other interesting and cool work, and a promo bump of work of friends or other associates. Inspiring quotes about working hard and being nice. Maybe some politics, but not much if you want to appear above the fray. So maybe some just social cause stuff. And then, of course, there's Pinterest, right, where you can document your own encyclopedia of style and inspiration. And, of course, there's Instagram as well, where the most popular aesthetic is for one to sort of capture and document moments of their own lives as if they were cataloging their own lives in their own lifestyle catalog, right? It's like, here's my J. Crew catalog, but lived out in real life. So this is sort of leading to a little bit of a sort of homogenization of work, or homogenization of style. So, you know, here's my perfectly placed hot beverage along with my reading material, which I'm definitely reading. Here's me in a coffee shop doing the same thing. Here's my weekend in the country. Here's my weekend at the beach. Here's the city I'm in this week. Here's my beautiful bookshelf, or my friend's beautiful bookshelf. Here's my shoes. Here's what I'm making for dinner, which happens to look like a kinfolk spread. Here's the latest cool designy publication or product or object that I bought. Here's my clean but messy, but not too messy workspace. And of course, yeah, here's my brunch. If you Google, oh my God, brunch like went on forever. It was absurd. And we use social media and other platforms to sort of project extensions of our own personal brand by curating or art directing and using these sort of things as visual signifiers. This is what we want people to see about ourselves. I personally can't think of anything more particularly cliche in the design world today than the sort of obligatory "my standards manual came in the mail today" post. They're all not the same. I swear, they're all different. I gathered them myself, but they all sort of look the same, right? And here's the graphics manual, or the subway one as well. And I totally get it. I mean, I'm guilty of it as well. If you look at my Instagram feed, I have some sparse photos of my workspace. I set a few ground rules for myself: no photos of lattes or coffee in any form, no product placement or tags, and yes, oh, right, I almost forgot this one part. So it's so saturated that it's created this sort of offshoot of brand influencers or ambassadors or advocates. And it's gotten to a point where we're doing things like our pets and our children, but definitely more our peps, are these props and lifestyle accessories with their own product placement campaigns and birthdays and celebrations and all of that. And it's true, my dog does have an Instagram, but again, no props. She doesn't drink coffee either. No product placement, and she only follows like rescue organizations. That's how I work. So I guess what I'm trying to get here is really this sort of basic question of why we as sort of designers or creatives feel the necessity to perpetuate this designer lifestyle that embodies being a designer, because it most certainly is a sort of self-reinforcing act. And I will bring my employer back into the fold for one point. There was this story we published in the last issue of Baffler by this journalist in Australia, by Mia Tokumitsu, called "Did the Fun Work?", where she explores the relationship between leisure and productivity, or in other words, the modern construct that our own downtime, our own personal time, is now something to be documented and projected in order to be deemed successful or for it to count, right? Grammar, it didn't happen. And she writes, if the satisfaction of posting on social media derives from garnering likes and the so-called attention economy, then posters will, according to a crude market logic, select what they believe to be the most likable content for posting. And furthermore, will often alter their behavior to generate precisely that content. Yep, okay. Oh, it keeps going, okay. The mirror of social media metrics offers to show us whether we enjoyed ourselves, but just as with mirrors, we have to work to get back the reflection we want to see. So I find this especially interesting when we put this against the backdrop of our own sort of creative community taking pride in blurring the lines between our work and ourselves, and that we must live to work and not work to live. And that's what separates us from other professions, right? We're artists at heart. That being creative is beyond a profession, but a personality choice. It's a calling. It's a lifestyle. And I find this interesting against the backdrop of how our society now views the idea of leisure as something we need to get something out of in order to be successful. And to elaborate that, which is another quote which I think was good, the cult of productivity is a greedy thing. It sucks up both the time we spend in leisure and the very feelings it stirs in us. Happiness and other pleasant sensations must themselves become productive, which is why we talk of leisure being restorative or rejuvenating. Like, it can't just be leisure, it has to, do something for us. And I think, going back to what she said before, I think it's really interesting what she talks about the most likable content potentially altering behavior, which then generates more of the same content. Because another great eye-opening article that I read in the past year or so, I guess last summer, was by a journalist named Kyle Cheka, who wrote a piece in the US tech site Verge called Welcome to Airspace. And this concept of airspace, which is a term he sort of coined for the homogeneity of seemingly hip, modern, urban, cool, and unique spaces across the globe. And so he says, it's marked by an easily recognizable mix of symbols like reclaimed wood, Edison light bulbs, and refurbished industrial lighting. Guilty. That's meant to provide familiar, comforting surroundings for a wealthy, mobile elite who want to feel like they're visiting somewhere authentic while they travel. Sounds like authenticity is coming up a lot today. Interesting. But who actually crave more of just the same, more rustic interiors and sans serif logos, and splashes of cliche accent colors on rugs and walls. And I think his hypothesis really bears out well. When this is sort of what we all think of when we think of a coffee shop. He talks a lot about how Airbnb in particular, and the idea of projecting these sort of ideal interiors and these spaces and these rentals of sort of going to a different city but having it feel like home has really added to this sort of homogenization. And it's true, a lot of Airbnb interiors look very similar to each other. So another point that he brings up that I think is particularly interesting is, he said in other parts, it's not that these generic cafes are part of global change like Starbucks or Costa Coffee. Rather, they've all independently decided to adopt the same faux artisanal aesthetic. Or in other words, its aesthetic arises from the tens of thousands of people making the same independent decisions rather than a corporate mandate. So, we're doing this to ourselves, which is really fascinating. And he quotes somebody in his piece that says, it's funny, a New York artist and designer, of course, it's funny how you want these really generic things, but also want authenticity too. So, so what? So what are the consequences of this? What's the big deal? Well, I would argue that in the midst of our dribbling and our Pinteresting and our Tumblring frenzy, are we really sacrificing our own identities and perhaps our own voices in the process because we're spending so much time keeping up with the sort of designer Joneses, so to speak? Are we turning it into a sort of reductive popularity contest? Does it go back to these sort of rudimentary impulses to simply fit in order to be accepted? And I feel like we're getting to a point where we're spending so much time projecting our personal brand or our lifestyle that we wish to be associated with, that we're forgetting to perhaps keep our eyes open for new ways to be inspired. Are we creating a sort of unintended tunnel vision? Who decided that documenting bookshelves and coffee was the hallmark of a creative life? And again, the funny irony in all of this is that in a visual industry, as in a creative industry, we're supposed to be the innovative ones, promoting individualism, originality, and the unique. We're the ones who advocate for personal expression and use slogans like, be true to yourself, and get out of your comfort zone, and find yourself and love what you do. And in a world where everyone zigs, you should zag. We as a society collectively idealize those who take risk and in originality or stand up for beliefs. We even usurp many of these same aspirations to sell products and services. We wear these around like a badge of honor. Reinforcing existing visual trends is sort of perhaps the opposite of creativity in some ways. Going back to his airspace piece, because it's just so damn good, everybody should read it. The connective emotional grid of social media platforms is what drives the impression of airspace. If taste is globalized, then the logical endpoint is a world in which aesthetic diversity decreases. So that's kind of a not great consequence, is seeing the potential loss of a sort of diverse aesthetic that we're actually trying to seek out. And I would argue, and he argued as well, that we're also seeing a sort of reinforcement of socioeconomic status and the divides that come along with that. Sorry, I'm coming here from the US and it's all about class right now over there. So he also writes in the airspace piece, he quotes some other scholars. In their introduction to the fabric of cultures, fashion, identity, and globalization, the fashion scholars Eugenia Policelli and Hazel Clark write that this aesthetic gentrification divides the New World map in the light of a softer post-Cold War prejudice, the fashionable and the unfashionable world. In other words, there we go. In other words, we are experiencing an isolationism of style versus one of politics or physical geography, although it still falls along economic lines. And I think this is the really salient point. You either belong to the airspace class or you don't. And it's kind of true here, right? Like, designers are part of the well-heeled elite or the establishment class. There's been a lot of talk, I'd say, over the past, I don't know, 2010, 2009, talk of sort of the top 1%, but there's really been some great reporting on the real divide actually extending to the top 20%. And the design industry as a whole, particularly those who attend conferences, are part of that world. The corporate and the tech world, us as designers, us as creatives, are really directly affected by their success. So if they're doing well, then we're doing well because they're generating jobs for us, right? And we just kind of have to keep in mind that there's a certain status in having disposable income enough to afford to spend $1,200 on a floor lamp or $80 on a replica standards manual from the 1960s, or however they go for. I've never bought one of them. So this is another just boring, very boring graph that kind of shows the difference between where the bottom and the middle 40% are, and just how much the 81st%, or in other words, the top 20%, are sort of sailing higher and higher. And the more disconnected from regular people, meaning the other 80%, which, as we've seen from recent global events, furthers these reinforcements of inequality and these folks living in separate worlds. So what's the solution? How does one claim a sense of authenticity in their own lives? Well, I have some completely unsolicited, probably unasked for advice here. And I'm going to quote maybe my favorite Canadian ever, Naomi Klein. If you guys know her, no logo. Anybody over 30 here? Okay. Yeah. As she says in her book, what haunts me is not exactly the absence of literal space, so much as a deep craving for metaphorical sense, release, escape, some kind of open-ended freedom. And as I said, I'm by no means in position to give out advice, but I will say that my design life versus lifestyle sort of realization moment came into clarity when I moved away from New York. I went to art school there, went to SVA, and I lived there for a total of 12 years, and I thought I was destined to live there forever. I worked my way up to heading the art department of a prominent Newsweekly magazine. It's called Newsweek. At age 30, and thought I'd just sort of continue that trajectory in a design management or design leadership position. But after heading up my second art department at another news and politics magazine called Foreign Policy in DC, I realized I didn't want that kind of responsibility or sort of work environment. It stifled my creativity, and I felt stuck, even though the positions paid handsomely and afforded me a certain kind of lifestyle. So this is kind of where I was before my trajectory, and now I've kind of stepped off, or jumped off a cliff, perhaps. So after positions like that in New York and DC, I thought I had to take a different approach and change priorities. If what I valued now was creative autonomy and freedom over title and status, then I had to set up my life to work within these boundaries and bring my cost of living down. Hence the reason I recently moved to Baltimore, as in like a month ago, which is a much more affordable city than New York or DC, or even the 3 months I spent in San Francisco, which was even worse. In Baltimore, my rent's half of what it was. I was renting a 2-bedroom apartment, and now I'm renting a 5-bedroom house. Yes. And it was $300 less than their asking price. I'm so excited. Anyway, so my rent's half of what it was. It's completely plausible to buy a row house and to sort of have that space and be able to create, a workspace and things like that. Totally within the realm of possibility. It's a city with low overhead where I can afford to fail, which means that I can afford to experiment. Whoops. Yeah. So I think setting yourself up with a situation where you can afford to fail or experiment or play is really important. And another piece of advice I would give would be to sort of make room for other influences. And when I say room, I mean, yes, physical room, but the time and the headspace for it as well. In other words, maybe get off the internet a little bit, or at very least get off the same design sites that everyone looks at, or the same shows and exhibitions or events that everyone goes to, and the same publications that everyone reads, and intentionally seek out other sources for inspiration. Or at the very, very least, question what you're looking at. Question what and why you're looking at something on these platforms. Are you seeking out something you haven't seen before? Does it have a certain comfort or familiarity to it, that particular aesthetic, and is that why it's attracting you? And you're just like, more, give me more. Think about how a change in your surroundings, whether it be physical or relationship or friendship-wise, could influence you. And no, I'm not telling you to break up with your significant other or anything, but I would say I sort of intentionally try to avoid hanging out with designers all the time, though they're definitely my core group of friends. They're my friends. They're from college. They know me. I'm very comfortable there, but I also try to hang out with writers and journalists and activists. My boyfriend's a historian, and that's influenced me big time. This is kind of my grid of influence right now. And one of the things I've also done is sort of looked into my past and the things that sort of inspired me before I became a designer. That's actually where sports and baseball and, yes, mascots come in. What else? Oh, and the documenting my family's past, which is something I've been another project I've been trying to work on, kind of feeds into this storytelling nature that I get from editorial design and just being a visual communicator in general. And of course, there's the historical aspect and the sort of appreciation or application of ephemera and artifacts as well. So I would say going back to that airspace piece one more time, if I can reference it, one of the things he mentions is on Airbnb's site, they recommend that owners who are renting out their homes, or developers or whatever, show personality and not personal items. Well, I'm here to say no, show your personal items, not some generic construct of personality, whatever that means. And lastly, sort of get dirty and get unperfect and get unedited or perhaps uncurated. Get out of your rut and, as Danny said, get out of your comfort zone. If you haven't made something with your hands for a while, maybe that would help. I know feel like I've been just putting images in boxes for 12 years. And I bought a Xerox machine, and I have some space, and I can't wait to dig in. So that would be my suggestion. So my sort of ending mission or argument is that your design life shouldn't be your lifestyle per se. But I do believe that you should, sort of hashtag live your best life. So thank you.
Yeah.